The death of Moses, one of the greatest mysteries of the Bible. For centuries, the official story tells us that Moses died on Mount Nebo. But did it really happen that way? What does the Bible actually say about this crucial moment? Why was no one there to witness his death? And what's behind the dispute between God and Satan over his body? Get ready to uncover hidden details, mysterious passages, and secrets that could change everything you thought you knew. Stay until the end, because what we're about to reveal might shock you. The scorching heat of the desert now seemed more like an ally than an enemy. Moses, with his gray hair and skin marked by years of journeying, knew his body was close to yielding to nature. The wrinkles on his face carried the traces of an intense life, of a challenging leadership, and of unwavering faith. But beyond his body, his spirit was preparing for the great destiny that was approaching. 40 years ago, he had led the Israelites, men and women wandering through the vastness of the desert in search of the promised land. Every step he took reflected his obedience to the divine call, but the time had come for Moses, and he knew this with a quiet certainty. However, the promise that God had made to him, to not enter the promised land, hung like a shadow in his heart. What fate did not foresee, however, was how his death would unfold. God did not allow him to die in a common manner. Moses' death would not be accompanied by a funeral procession, nor a tomb filled with flowers. Instead, the leader of the people of Israel was taken to a secret place, far from any human gaze, where God himself would tend to his burial. No one would ever know where he was. Moses, when called to this fate, seemed to understand that it would be a farewell without a farewell. The mystery surrounding the location of his burial became an unbeatable enigma, a legend that would pass through generations. Some believed his body rested under a hidden hill, deep in the desert, where the relentless heat would become the guardian of his eternal rest. Others, bolder, theorized that Moses had not died, but had been taken to the heavens as an immortal prophet, accompanied by a whirlwind of divine light, like Enoch and Elijah, biblical figures who had also been taken in mysterious ways. The theological explanations were many, but none had a definitive answer. In oral tradition, stories spread that angels, sent by God, had taken Moses' body, hiding it in a place where even the greatest kings could not find it. In other legends, God himself sealed the earth over him, causing him to be consumed by it, so that the Israelites would not build a tomb and worship him as a deity. This mystery, at its core, was not merely a search for a lost body in the desert, but a search for the deeper meaning of Moses' journey. His end, in a divine sense, symbolized that the mission he had fulfilled on earth had come to an end, and the greatness of his role would not be measured by physical permanence in a land, but by the spiritual transformation he had brought to the people of Israel. The fact that no human being ever found his tomb transformed Moses' death into an icon of mystery and reverence. The very mystery of his death elevated him to the status of a living legend, one that would continue to inspire generations. His body, hidden under the scorching sands, would become the symbol of something deeper, a legacy that transcends death and rests in the heart of faith, where questions and answers intertwine in the vastness of the unknown. Moses, the great leader who led a people toward freedom, would continue to live in the echoes of history, not in a visible tomb, but in the hearts and minds of those who still, today, ask, where does Moses' body rest? The answer may never be revealed, but the journey of his life, marked by faith, obedience, and the struggle for a people, would never be forgotten. In a time marked by shadows and oppression, Egypt flourished as the greatest power of the ancient world, its pyramids and temples touching the sky as monuments of an unmatched civilization. But behind this grandeur, a growing fear gripped the heart of the pharaoh. The Hebrews, a foreign people dwelling along the banks of the Nile, were multiplying in number and strength. Fearing that their increasing population might one day pose a threat to the empire, the pharaoh issued a relentless decree. All male babies born among the Hebrews were to be killed. The decree sounded like a cry of terror, spreading panic among the Hebrew families. However, amidst this dark scene, the birth of a child would occur in an extraordinary way. Jochebed, a Hebrew woman, was expecting her son. She knew the danger was imminent, and if the baby were a boy, his life would be taken in the first days of his existence. But instead of succumbing to fear, she trusted in something greater than the oppression of the pharaoh. She trusted in the strength of hope and maternal love. For 3 months, Jochebed hid her son in her house, caring for him with a tenderness and love that defied the cruel reality around her. With every cry from the baby, every suspended breath, she knew that time was running out. She could not keep him hidden for much longer. The threat was growing, and her courage had to be stronger than the fear. So, with a heavy heart, Jochebed made a decision that would change the course of history. She prepared a basket, waterproofing it so it could withstand the current of the Nile. She placed the baby inside, holding him for the last time before releasing him into the waters of the great river. With trembling hands and eyes filled with tears, she sent him down the Nile, entrusting his life to the river that had long been a symbol of life and death for the Egyptian people. This act of courage, mixed with pain and hope, was not simple abandonment. It was a confident surrender to destiny, a wager on something she could not see but believed in with all her being. The Nile, with its vast and mysterious waters, carried the basket with the child. Not knowing what the future held, Jochebed withdrew to wait, her soul anguished, for what would happen next. Meanwhile, the baby, wrapped in a basket of reeds, floated down the river, surrounded by palm trees and waters that stretched infinitely before him. The baby's fate, which carried the future of his nation, was in the hands of the improbable. When the basket finally reached one of the banks, fate, or perhaps divine providence, intervened. The pharaoh's daughter, while bathing in the Nile, discovered the basket. The baby's cry, echoing among the banks, touched her heart in an inexplicable way. Moved by an inexplicable impulse, she extended her hands and lifted the child from the water. Seeing the fragility of life in her arms, the pharaoh's daughter, unknowingly, touched the destiny of a nation. It was then that Miriam, the baby's sister, who had discreetly followed the basket, appeared. She cleverly suggested that a Hebrew woman breastfeed the child, a proposal that, as if by miracle, was accepted by the Egyptian princess. Thus, the baby was returned to his mother, Jochebed, without the pharaoh's daughter knowing his true identity. The woman who had feared for her son's life was restored to his side, and the child she would nurse was about to grow in a world she could never have imagined. This baby, who escaped death through a miracle, would be more than just a boy. He would become the leader of an oppressed people, the man who, guided by God's hand, would lead the Israelites to freedom, changing the course of history forever. But for now, he was just a baby, a lost son, and at the same time, protected by destiny and his mother's hope. Egypt, with all its grandeur and oppression, little knew that the greatest of its destinies was about to be rewritten in the silent waters of the Nile. The pharaoh's daughter, with her heart touched by the baby's cry, lifted him from the reeds with hands that, unknowingly, were carrying the fate of an entire nation. It was a scene that seemed marked by a divine touch. She looked at the child with a mixture of curiosity and tenderness, and without hesitation, decided to adopt him as her own son. The fragility of the baby contrasted with the grandeur of Egypt, but something in that moment made the world around her seem suspended. She named the baby Moses, which in Egyptian meant saved from the waters, a direct tribute to the miraculous way he had been rescued. Moses, now belonging to the royal palace, was taken to the princess's luxurious chambers. He would grow up surrounded by fine carpets, walls adorned with gold and marble, and servants and masters who would teach him everything about Egyptian culture, the art of war, philosophy, astronomy, and above all, the code of the empire. The royal palace became his new home, and Pharaoh's daughter, who would care for him as a mother, began to shape him for the great destiny that awaited him. Meanwhile, Moses, a Hebrew boy born under the shadow of death, lived in the opulence and privileges of the Egyptian court. His identity as a Hebrew, however, never disappeared from his soul. He knew that his blood was different from the people around him. He felt it in every furtive glance, in every gesture that separated him from the true Egyptian lineage. But this secret did not shake him in his childhood. Even the palace walls seemed to comfort him in his confusion of feelings. However, even within the grandeur of the palace, Moses' fate was far from being determined by wealth and titles. The nights were long and lonely, and Moses often questioned his true origin. Although his biological mother had been separated from him, Miriam, his sister, was always nearby. Many times, she would approach him discreetly, feeding his curiosity with stories about the Hebrew people and the suffering of his nation under the Egyptian yoke. It was during these formative years that Moses began to notice the harshness of the Hebrews' lives in Egypt. He saw, with sadness and indignation, how his people were treated. They were enslaved, forced to work on the massive construction of pharaonic monuments, and lived under the constant fear of oppression. As comfortable and luxurious as life in the palace was, something inside Moses drove him to question the injustice around him. He found himself torn between the riches of the Egyptian empire and the silent suffering of his people. One morning, as he walked through the streets of an Egyptian city, Moses was confronted by a scene that deeply shook him. He saw a cruel Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave with a whip mercilessly, and something inside him broke. For the first time, Moses felt the pain of the people he belonged to more intensely than any luxury or power the Egyptian court could offer. The man was brutal and without mercy, and Moses' blood boiled with rage. Without thinking of the consequences, Moses approached and in a burst of fury, killed the Egyptian with his own hands. The act was swift, but it immortalized his transgression. As he moved away from the scene, he felt that something had changed within him. He knew this could not be hidden forever. The weight of what he had done seemed to suffocate him, and his thoughts began to scramble. He could no longer be just a spectator to the suffering of his people. But at the same time, he knew his actions could lead to his downfall. The news of the murder quickly spread, and Moses realized that the comfortable life he had had in the palace was about to crumble. Fearing for his life, he fled to the desert of Midian, leaving behind wealth and privilege, but carrying with him the pain and the feeling of loss. It was at this moment that the young Egyptian prince, in an act of courage and repentance, left Egypt behind, unaware that his journey would lead him to meet his true destiny. Moses' future was about to be rewritten, no longer as an Egyptian prince, but as a leader of the Hebrew people, called to a role he had never imagined. What would follow was a pivotal chapter, where his very soul would be transformed, preparing him to face not only Egypt, but also the inner demons that haunted him. After fleeing to the desert of Midian, Moses entered a new chapter of his life, far from the opulent halls of the Egyptian palace where he had been treated as a prince. The desert, with its silent vastness and cold nights, was now his home. He felt like a man divided, torn between two worlds that could never unite. However, his new life also brought him an unexpected peace. He found refuge in the camp of the priest Jethro, where, free from the pressures of being heir to the Egyptian throne, Moses could focus on who he really was. Among sheep and tents, he learned humility, to listen to the wind passing through the desert, and to feel the weight of silence, which in some way healed the wounds of his soul. It was there that he met Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, a simple woman but full of wisdom, who would help him understand more about his own heart. Moses married her and began working as a shepherd. In the desert, life was modest, but the lessons he learned daily shaped his character. He, who had once been an Egyptian prince, now saw himself as a simple man of the field, responsible for taking care of his flock. The burden of being a man of Egypt seemed to disappear with each day he spent away from the wealth and glory of his homeland. But within him, something deeper could not be erased. He still carried the burden of being a Hebrew, and in his most solitary moments, he felt the pain of his people's exile, the oppression that marked them, and the invisible chains that imprisoned them. He knew that, although he had abandoned Egypt, his true mission had not yet been fulfilled. Something was calling him back, and he could not ignore it. The desert, with all its isolation, became a metaphor for the internal struggle Moses fought. He did not feel fully Egyptian, but he also couldn't recognize himself as a Hebrew. In the palace, he had been raised to be Egyptian, but his heart beat for the people suffering under the empire's rule. However, there was a bitter irony in it. Moses had been raised in the finest Egyptian traditions, and his spirit still carried the weight of the education and values of that culture. Egyptian culture was a part of his soul that he could not forget, but neither could he ignore his heritage as a Hebrew. In his moments of introspection, Moses saw himself as someone divided, a man between two worlds. However, the real battle was not between the Egyptians and the Hebrews, but within his own being. He was becoming someone capable of looking beyond the boundaries that separated him from others, someone able to understand the nuances of cultures, traditions, and human pain. He had been taught to fight and to govern, but the desert was teaching him to listen and to serve. Moses knew that his identity was not just a matter of where he was born or where he lived. His true identity was in the choices he would make and the purpose he would decide to follow. He felt that his destiny was waiting for him, like a river flowing toward the sea, but he still did not know how this river would take him to the promised land. As he looked at the vast, endless horizon of the desert, Moses felt a strength within him, as if the desert had transformed him into someone new, someone who could lead. Though his life had been marked by doubt and insecurity, he was now beginning to understand that true leadership was born from pain and internal struggle. The man who had once been an Egyptian prince was now becoming the man who would lead a people to freedom. He was no longer just Moses, the Egyptian. He was beginning to be Moses, the leader of a people, shaped by his experience, his faith, and the inner strength that was born in the desert. This was the crucial moment when Moses' dual identity began to merge into a single mission, a mission greater than he could have ever imagined. The journey of a man torn between two worlds was now becoming a journey of faith, sacrifice, and leadership. Moses was becoming the man who would face Egypt, a man who could never be contained, for his true identity did not come from the lands of the Pharaoh, but from the lands God was about to show him. The peace of the desert didn't last forever. Although Moses had found a new life in Midian, something deep inside him called him back to Egypt. The weight of his identity, torn between Egyptian privileges and the suffering of his people, was becoming a growing burden. Years passed, but the desire to seek justice for his people didn't fade. He still heard, in his deepest thoughts, the sound of chains imprisoning the Hebrews, and the cries of pain from those who, like him, had been made slaves. One morning, as he walked through the streets of Egypt, something within Moses ignited. He saw an Egyptian man, a cruel one, brutally whipping a Hebrew slave. The sight of violence was not new to him, but this time it was different. Something inside him broke. The blood of his people, the suffering of his nation, finally spoke louder than the memories of his life in the palace. In a burst of impulse, Moses rushed toward the Egyptian, his body acting on its own, driven by a rage built up over years of silence. With strong hands and a heart inflamed with justice, Moses killed the man. He buried him in the desert, thinking no one would ever find out what he had done. But he was wrong. Egypt, where Moses still carried the weight of being a prince, was now turning into a place of betrayal and death. His impulsive act did not go unnoticed. The next day, Moses learned that his actions had been observed. Two Hebrews, witnesses to the murder, began talking amongst themselves. They didn't see Moses as a hero, but as someone who was risking everything by taking justice into his own hands. They questioned his authority and role. Moses, unaware that he had been discovered, found himself in a dilemma. When he learned that Pharaoh had found out about what happened, fear overwhelmed him. The king wouldn't hesitate to take action against him. Moses, already feeling the guilt and anguish over his hasty actions, knew he had no place left in Egypt. He would flee once again, but this time, not as a prince hiding in the shadows of the palace, but as a fugitive, someone who had lost not only his position, but also the respect of his own people. Pharaoh issued an execution order. Moses' name would become a threat to be erased. Egypt, the empire where he had been raised, was now a place where his life meant nothing. With no more options, Moses left everything he knew behind and headed for the desert. As he fled, Moses felt the weight of loneliness. It wasn't just the fear of dying, but the fear of being completely lost, of not knowing who he truly was or what he was supposed to do. The man who had once been a prince was now an exile, a fugitive from his own destiny. He had killed, but what had he truly gained from it? Revenge didn't bring peace. On the contrary, it only left a void. He passed through Egypt's gates, leaving behind the memories of his childhood, the riches, and the culture that had shaped him. But the longing for his people would never leave him. The man who fled now became more than just an exile. He became a broken man, someone with a destiny still unclear. The desert of Midian, where he would seek refuge, would be his home now, but the weight of his mistake, the injustice he had tried to correct so impulsively, still pressed heavily on his shoulders. Moses knew he couldn't turn back, but he also knew his journey wasn't over. That reckless act would lead him down a new path, one where his faith and leadership would be shaped not just by loss, but by the responsibility of leading a people to freedom. Moses, now a fugitive, saw the desert stretch before him like a vast emptiness, filled with uncertainties and new lessons he couldn't yet comprehend. He had left Egypt behind, its wealth, his life as a prince, and even his people. Now, without direction, without a clear purpose, he threw himself into the solitude of the Midian desert, a place as barren as his soul, yet unexpectedly, it would become the stage of his transformation. After several days of walking, exhausted and hopeless, Moses arrived in the land of the Midianites. It was a dry region, surrounded by mountains, with small nomadic camps where shepherding was the main way of life. Still disoriented and afraid, he saw there an opportunity to start anew, although he knew his past couldn't be erased. The weight of his mistakes and choices still followed him. In one of the camps, Moses found shelter with Jethro, a priest of Midian, who welcomed him kindly. Jethro, a wise and experienced man, saw in Moses someone marked by pain and regret, but also someone with potential for something greater. Moses, with his torn identity, found himself accepting the hospitality, not because he was merely seeking shelter, but because his heart still clung to the idea of rebuilding what he had destroyed. Jethro offered him not just shelter, but also a new life. Moses married Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, and the peace of home became his new reality. Each day, he found himself further from his past, farther from his Egyptian identity. He now tended to his father-in-law's flock of sheep, a simple occupation, but one that, at the same time, gave him time to reflect and, in some way, process his losses and mistakes. The life of a shepherd was not easy, but it was solitary, and perhaps, in this isolation, Moses began to find the answers he sought. The heat of the day burned his skin, and the cold of the night reminded him that, though he had found a new home, his soul was still in search of purpose. The vast desert landscapes, with their stones and hills, challenged him to face the loneliness of his own mind and heart. But it was during this period of stillness and reflection that Moses began to learn important lessons that would change his path. He learned patience by watching the sheep, which, in their own way, adapted to the desert. He learned humility by seeing that, unlike the grandeur of Egypt, he was now a simple shepherd. He learned the importance of leadership not in grand battles, but in small gestures, in protecting his flock, in searching for water and pasture. In fact, Moses' exile wasn't just a punishment. It was a preparation for what was to come. Each step he took in that dry desert brought him closer to transformation. He was no longer the Egyptian prince, but a man shaped by life's adversities and by the experience of failure. In the silence of the desert, Moses was becoming something more, something beyond his former identity. Time passed. He didn't know what the future held, but in some way, he was learning to live in the present. And it was during these years of apparent calm, while tending Jethro's flock, that God's calling quietly approached. Moses was, unknowingly, being prepared for a return, not just to Egypt, but for his greater destiny, to free a people. It was a hot afternoon in the Midian desert. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a golden light that tinted the rocks and hills around him. As usual, Moses guided Jethro's flock to pasture. The sound of the dry wind blowing through the stones was his only companion, and in his heart, loneliness seemed to become a constant friend. Even after so many years in exile, he still carried the scars of his flight, the memories of a distant Egypt, and the weight of guilt that followed him like a shadow. Then something strange happened. In the midst of the desert's silence, Moses noticed a bright light in the distance, something that didn't seem normal. He furrowed his brow, trying to understand what it was. At first, he thought it was a mirage. The desert, with its relentless heat, sometimes made things seem distant or unreal. But as he got closer, the vision became clearer. It was a bush, a thorny plant common in the desert, but what made it unusual was the fact that it was on fire, completely engulfed in flames. And even more surprising, the bush wasn't consumed, the fire didn't destroy it. Moses, filled with curiosity and at the same time, an inexplicable sense of fear, slowly approached. His heart raced. The flames seemed to dance, but the leaves of the plant remained intact. What he was witnessing wasn't a natural scene, it was something supernatural. When he got close enough, a voice resonated from within the flames, deep and commanding. "Moses! Moses!" The voice called his name, echoing with an authority that made his blood run cold. He quickly turned, looking around, but there was no one. The bush was speaking. He instinctively knelt, covering his face with his hands, fearful, as if he knew he was in the presence of something divine. The voice continued, "Do not come near here. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses, trembling, obeyed immediately. He knew this was an encounter with the supernatural, something far beyond his understanding. His mind, which had already been shaped by doubt and pain, was now confronted with a reality he had never imagined. This bush was not just fire, it was the presence of God. Then, the voice continued, revealing itself as God. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their oppressors, for I know their sufferings. Now come, and I will send you to Egypt." Moses, astonished, could not fully comprehend what was happening. It felt as though the ground beneath his feet was shaking. God, the one he had lost sight of so long ago, was now before him, calling him to a mission he could never have imagined. "Who am I?" Moses said hesitantly. "To go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt." God's voice responded firmly and compassionately. "I will be with you." Moses, still in disbelief, asked, "If I go to the children of Israel and tell them that the God of their fathers has sent me to them, and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God then answered with words that echoed through eternity. "I am who I am. Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" These words were more than just an answer. They were a revelation of the divine essence, the immeasurable mystery of God, the one who has always existed, who is not dependent on time or circumstances. "I am" was a name that transcended all human limitations. Moses stood there, on his knees, paralyzed by the greatness of what he had just heard. But at the same time, a flame of courage began to ignite within him. The mission seemed impossible, but God was with him. God was asking him to be the instrument of liberation for his people. Moses, who had long felt lost and directionless, now knew his calling. The bush continued to burn with fire, but Moses, still trembling, felt a different warmth. The warmth of God's presence, renewing him and preparing him for the path he would have to take. He could no longer run. The desert, which had once been a place of exile, was now the starting point of an epic journey. And so, before the burning bush, Moses was transformed. He would no longer be just a man with a past of failures and regrets, but the chosen leader to free his people. God's voice still echoed in his mind, and the mission was clear. He must return to Egypt, challenge Pharaoh, and lead the Israelites to freedom. But this journey would not be easy. The fight for the destiny of his people was only beginning. Moses was back in the desert, with the mission etched into his soul, to free the people of Israel from the oppression of Egypt. Yet the task seemed impossible. After so much time away from his homeland, he felt like a stranger, someone who no longer had the right to claim his place among the Israelites. Furthermore, the idea of confronting Pharaoh, the absolute ruler of Egypt, was terrifying. He, Moses, who had fled Egypt as a criminal, was now being called to return and challenge the very king. When God's voice spoke to him from the burning bush, the mission seemed clear. But now, looking at the desert before him, he was filled with a whirlwind of doubts. His brother Aaron was with him, and this offered some security, but still, fear crept into his thoughts. Egypt, with its opulence and cruelty, seemed distant, but at the same time, so close in his mind. How could he, a man who had become a shepherd, confront the greatest power of the ancient world? In his wisdom, God had not only given Moses a command, he had given him signs, miracles that would confirm he was with him. Moses' staff had turned into a serpent, and when touched again, it became a rod. His hand, which had become leprous, was healed instantly. These signs were not only proofs that God was with him, they were demonstrations of his absolute power, something Moses needed not only to see, but to believe. "Go, Moses," God said, with his firm and comforting voice. "I will be with you. Do not fear, for I will perform wonders before Pharaoh." Moses, now more resolute, set out for Egypt. The journey back was not easy. The relentless sun and desert sands seemed to want to discourage him, but he could not waver. Aaron was by his side, acting as his spokesperson and ally, but Moses knew the mission was his, and he had to be the leader, not just the observer. As they reached the gates of Egypt, Moses and Aaron found themselves before a challenge even greater than they had imagined. Pharaoh, powerful and unbeatable, was feared by all, and his court was filled with wisdom and magic. Moses knew that a simple request for freedom for the Israelites would not be enough. He would have to go to the very foundations of Pharaoh's power and ask him to free not just a small group, but an entire people. When Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The walls of Ramses II's palace were imposing, and the gazes of the courtiers watching them were filled with disdain. Pharaoh, with his stern expression, looked at Moses and Aaron with skepticism, giving no indication that he would consider their proposal. "Moses and Aaron," Pharaoh said with an authoritative voice, "why have you come here, disturbing the peace of Egypt? Who is this God of yours, and why should I, the great Pharaoh, listen to you? Egypt is strong, and the gods of Egypt are many. I have no time for your words." Moses, despite his inner trembling, replied firmly, "The Lord God of Israel has sent me. He says, 'Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness.'" Pharaoh, laughing with contempt, responded, "Who is this Lord that I should obey him? I do not know this God, nor do I have any reason to free the Israelites. If they want freedom, let them work even harder." It was then that Pharaoh, with a merciless gesture, ordered that the forced labor of the Israelites be made even more severe. The working conditions became unbearable, and frustration took hold of the people. But Moses did not let himself be shaken. He knew Pharaoh's power was great, but God's power was infinitely greater. The message Moses brought to Pharaoh was clear. God said, "Let my people go," but Pharaoh continued to refuse. The hardness of his heart was in full force. Moses knew the battle had only just begun. He and Aaron left the palace, and a sense of tension filled the air, as if something big was about to happen. Pharaoh had refused, and now, God's power would show its strength in ways Pharaoh could never have imagined. Moses, now certain of the mission given to him, was preparing to face the greatest test of his life. Egypt, which had once been his home, would now be the stage for a confrontation between human power and divine strength. The land of Egypt was about to be struck by a series of calamities, disasters that would shake the foundations of an empire that until then had seemed indestructible. Moses, with a determined look, prepared for the next stage of the mission God had given him, to challenge Pharaoh and force his hand to release the people of Israel. The first plague was a terrifying sign of divine power. The waters of the Nile, which were the lifeblood of Egypt, turned into blood. The river, which once brought fertility and sustenance, became a red sea of death, preventing the people from drinking and quenching their thirst. The unbearable smell and the grotesque sight of dead fish scattered in the water were a clear warning to Pharaoh. But he, hardened, ignored the call. With the Pharaoh remaining stubborn, God's punishment continued. With a snap of Moses' staff, Egypt was invaded by a swarm of frogs. They appeared everywhere, in houses, palaces, beds, and even kitchens. Fear gripped the people, who found themselves unable to rid themselves of the creatures. Once again, the Pharaoh asked Moses to pray to his God to drive the frogs away, promising to release the Israelites if the plague was removed. When the promise was made, Moses interceded, and the frogs disappeared. But as had become common, the Pharaoh went back on his word, and the people remained in bondage. The third plague brought lice, which infested all the Egyptians and their animals. It was an unbearable plague, turning the Egyptians into victims of an unrelenting infestation. The desert sand seemed to come to life, covering the skin of both men and animals, driving the Egyptians to the brink of madness. Next, a cloud of flies covered the cities, with swarms attacking relentlessly. But as terrifying as it was, this plague did not touch the homes of the Israelites. God began to show the distinction between his people and Egypt, a clear sign that the Egyptians were being punished for their stubbornness. When the fourth plague passed, the fifth arrived. The Egyptian livestock was decimated by a fatal disease. Cows, sheep, and camels dropped dead, and Egypt's economy, which heavily depended on livestock, suffered a devastating blow. Misery increased, but the Pharaoh continued to resist, ignoring his people's suffering and God's power. The sixth plague covered the Egyptians with painful tumors and sores. The people, already weakened by the previous plagues, now faced physical suffering, with wounds appearing without explanation. Pain and despair were palpable, and people dragged themselves through the streets, begging for relief. However, the Pharaoh remained firm in his hardened heart, once again refusing to release the Israelites. The seventh plague was a devastating hailstorm, with large stones falling from the sky, destroying everything in their path: crops, buildings, and even animals. Fear took over the people, and many Egyptians began to fear Moses' power, seeking shelter. But the Pharaoh, immune to the destruction around him, remained obstinate. Soon, the eighth plague descended upon Egypt, a locust invasion. They devoured everything that the hail had not destroyed. The fields, once green and prosperous, were now desolate, and the land that had once been fertile became a vast, lifeless desert. The suffering was so great that the Pharaoh, for the first time, admitted his mistake and asked Moses to pray for him. But as before, the promise of liberation was forgotten as soon as the deliverance came. The ninth plague brought darkness, a veil of blackness that covered Egypt for 3 days. Nothing could be seen, no one moved, and the silence was absolute. Fear and anxiety gripped the nation, for the Egyptians were used to the sun shining on their land. But now the darkness took over everything, and it seemed as though life itself was being suffocated. Finally, the 10th and most terrible plague arrived. God announced that death would visit every Egyptian household, taking the firstborn of each family, from the Pharaoh's son to the servant's son. The suffering was indescribable. Fathers and mothers lost their children, and mourning echoed throughout Egypt, a sound of pain and despair. It was then that the Pharaoh, finally, upon the loss of his own son, capitulated. He called Moses and Aaron, and with a look of defeat and anguish, he said, "Take your children and go, as your God has commanded." Egypt was devastated. The Pharaoh had yielded, but the price paid for his stubbornness had been immense. The 10 plagues, manifestations of God's power and wrath, had fulfilled their purpose: to free the people of Israel and show the world the supremacy of the Lord over all the gods of Egypt. The night that followed the 10th plague was marked by a unique tension. Egypt was in ruins, and cries of pain echoed throughout the land. However, in the camp of the Israelites, the atmosphere was different. There, the people were preparing for something grand, something that would forever change their history and identity. The first Passover was about to take place. God, in his infinite wisdom, knew that Egypt's suffering alone wouldn't free the people, for the Pharaoh's heart was still hardened. He needed more. The people had to prepare for their freedom with an act of faith and obedience, a sacrifice that would mark the beginning of a new journey. Instructed by Moses, each Israelite family was to sacrifice a perfect lamb, without defect, and sprinkle its blood on the doorposts and lintels. The blood of the lamb would be a sign of protection. For that night, the angel of death would pass over Egypt and take the lives of the firstborn, but would pass over the homes of the Israelites, sparing them. As the people prepared, a deep sense of urgency and reverence took over everyone. They roasted the lamb over the fire and prepared unleavened bread, for there was no time for the dough to rise. The manna from the last meal was consumed quickly, with no delays. It was a meal for a people on the move, for those who needed to be ready to leave everything behind. That night, the Israelites celebrated the first Passover, eating the lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs, remembering the bitter suffering of slavery they were about to leave behind. It was a meal of transition, a meal that spoke of pain and hope, of liberation and an unknown future, but one full of promises. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the pain was unmatched. When the angel of death passed over each house, the firstborn fell, victims of God's wrath. The mourning that followed was unbearable. Entire families lost their children, and the Pharaoh, heartbroken, had no choice but to submit to God's power. The next morning, Egypt was silent, but that silence was filled with profound sorrow. The Pharaoh, devastated by the loss of his own son, called Moses and Aaron, finally yielding. He ordered them to leave, taking with them the Israelites and all their belongings. The people of Israel, ready to leave the land of slavery, departed in haste, carrying with them the legacy of the first Passover, which would become an eternal celebration of their liberation. Thus, Passover was born as a memorial, not just of suffering, but of victory, transformation, and hope for a future where God's people would be free to worship and serve the Lord. Every year, the remembrance of that night and the sacrificed lamb would become a symbol of faith, a celebration of liberation, and a sign of the promise that redemption would always come, even in the darkest of hours. After the painful night of the first Passover, a new dawn brought with it the long-awaited freedom. The Israelites, finally freed from Egyptian oppression, were ready to begin their journey to the Promised Land. But like every great liberation, the road ahead was far from easy. Moses led the people, guided by God's invisible hand, but destiny had more challenges in store for them. The Pharaoh, however, did not easily accept defeat. His decision to release the Israelites had been made in a moment of desperation, and soon he regretted it. When the people of Israel were on their way to the desert, the Pharaoh changed his mind. Filled with rage and pride, he gathered his army, the strongest in the ancient world, and set out after the fugitives. The Egyptian army, with its chariots and well-trained soldiers, seemed like an unbeatable force, and soon the Israelites found themselves surrounded. The situation was desperate. Ahead, the Red Sea, vast and treacherous, stretched to the horizon, and behind them, the Pharaoh's army was quickly approaching, in a cloud of dust and metal. The Israelites, frightened and confused, began to question their decision to follow Moses. Many feared that the liberation had been an illusion, and that now they would face certain death, either at the hands of the Egyptians or by the waters of the sea. It was then that Moses, in a moment of pure trust in the Lord, raised his hand and commanded the people to move forward, in the midst of desperation, with faith. God, who had never abandoned his people, responded in a miraculous way. A powerful column of cloud and fire descended from the sky, separating the Israelites from the Egyptians. The waters of the sea began to stir, and in an absolute miracle, a dry path appeared before them. The Israelites, astonished and awestruck, began to cross the sea floor, with the waters rising like walls around them, a terrifying and grand sight. Each step was an affirmation of their faith, a move toward freedom. The path seemed endless, but under divine protection, the waters would not give way, and the people moved toward the other shore. Meanwhile, the Egyptian army, unaware of what awaited them, launched themselves after them. But as the last of the Israelites crossed, the column of cloud and fire disappeared, allowing the Egyptians to approach. When the last Egyptian soldier touched the seabed, the waters returned with full force, submerging Pharaoh's army. The destruction was total, and the Israelites' liberation was completed. On the opposite shore of the Red Sea, the people of Israel looked back, and the spectacle of destruction and victory was indescribable. Moses, exultant, stood to praise God, and all the Israelites sang the song of liberation. It was a song of triumph, not just over Egypt, but over any enemy that might rise against God's chosen people. This crossing was not just a physical change of location, but a profound spiritual transformation. The people of Israel had been tested, but now, on the other side of the Red Sea, they were truly free. Egypt, with all its chains and oppressions, was behind them, and before them lay a new future, filled with challenges, but also with the promises of a land flowing with milk and honey. The crossing of the Red Sea would become one of the greatest landmarks in Israel's history, an eternal reminder of God's power to save and liberate his people, no matter how impossible the situation might seem. With the tremendous miracle of the Red Sea still fresh in the minds and hearts of the Israelites, the joy of their liberation was soon replaced by a new challenge: the desert. That barren land, with no end in sight, seemed to represent a test even greater than any enemy they had faced before. The path to the promised land would not be easy, and more than ever, the people would need to trust in God to survive. The desert was relentless. The scorching sun burned their skin, and the cold nights froze their bones. There was no abundant food, nor fresh water, only sand and rocks, and the distant echo of an uncertain future. As the days passed, anxiety began to take hold of the Israelites' minds. The difficulties increased, and soon the first signs of dissatisfaction emerged. With each step, the people remembered the onions, garlic, and meat of Egypt, the delicacies of their enslaved life, which now seemed far more appetizing than the uncertainty of the desert. They quickly forgot the hardships of slavery, trading the pain of oppression for the pain of abandonment in the desert. They began to murmur against Moses, blaming him for bringing them there to die of hunger and thirst. However, God would not abandon them. The same God who had parted the Red Sea would now show his care in every aspect of their journey. When the people cried out for food, God sent manna, a mysterious substance that fell from the sky every morning. It was like a white flake, which, when cooked, became something like sweet bread. They couldn't store it for the next day, as the manna lasted only 24 hours. Every day, they depended on God to provide for their needs, remembering that the true source of life was in the Lord. But the desert was not just about the scarcity of food and water. There was also the temptation of unbelief. When the water supplies ran out, the people, desperate, demanded that Moses bring them back to Egypt. They preferred to be slaves than die in the desert. It was at this moment that God, once again, intervened, commanding Moses to strike a rock from which water flowed. The spring appeared as a source of life in the middle of nowhere, a reminder that God is capable of providing in any circumstance. However, it was not only the physical needs that the Israelites needed to learn to trust God with. The journey through the desert was also a spiritual journey. Every step they took toward the promised land was a step toward maturity and faithfulness. God was not just feeding and sustaining them, but also challenging them to live according to his will. In every trial, there was a lesson, and in every challenge, an opportunity to trust more deeply in the Lord. The murmurs, however, did not cease. When they faced a shortage of meat, God sent quails, which covered the camp, allowing the people to eat. But even that was not enough to calm the spirit of the people. The lack of faith and constant doubt became a hallmark of their journey. Still, God did not abandon them. He continued to guide them, in his patience and mercy, reminding them that liberation was not a one-time event, but an ongoing journey of transformation and trust. Over the next 40 years, the desert not only shaped Israel's character, but also established the identity of a chosen nation, whose children would ultimately learn to depend completely on God. It would not be an easy road, but it would be the only road that would lead them to true freedom and the fulfillment of God's promises. And so, the journey through the desert continued, not just as a physical crossing, but as a spiritual pilgrimage that would test and strengthen the faith of a whole people. At the top of the mountain, surrounded by dark clouds and thunder rumbling on the horizon, Moses climbed alone, accompanied only by the presence of God. The crowd below, camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, watched with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The earth trembled with God's power, and the wind howled, as if nature itself were in reverence of the moment about to unfold. Moses, now leader of a nation in the making, was heading to that sacred place where God would manifest himself in a unique and transformative way. After days of preparation and purification, Moses reached the top of the mountain, where the voice of the Lord awaited him. The cloud that enveloped the mountain was dense, and the sound of trumpets echoed through the air, heightening the terror and respect of everyone around. Moses, with a heart full of anticipation, prepared to receive what would be the foundation of Israel's morality and spirituality, the 10 Commandments. God spoke to Moses with authority and clarity, establishing laws that not only regulated human interactions, but also their relationship with him. These laws would form the basis for the new covenant between God and his chosen people. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage," said the voice that echoed like thunder. Moses, listening attentively, transcribed every word with reverence. The commandments given at that moment were not just rules, but a call to transformation. "You shall have no other gods before me," commanded God, highlighting the importance of exclusive worship to him. "You shall not make for yourselves a graven image," he stated, rejecting the idolatry that had tried to infiltrate among the Israelites, especially when they were in Egypt. These were the first of the commandments, and as Moses heard them, he knew they were guidelines that would define the people's lives for generations. The giving of the commandments was a pivotal moment. It was not just a list of rules, but the reaffirmation that the Lord had a plan for his people, a plan of holiness, purity, and dedication to him. The commandments covered aspects of daily life, from the sanctification of the Sabbath to the need for respect for parents and human life. The morality established by God was not a human convention, but a divine order meant to guide Israel's behavior in all their interactions, with God and with others. After receiving the commandments, Moses descended the mountain, holding the stone tablets in his hands, radiating a bright light that reflected God's glory. The people, upon seeing him, were afraid, unable to approach him, as they sensed God's power in his face. But as Moses drew closer to the camp, something even more troubling was happening below. As Moses was away, the people began to stray. When Moses arrived at the camp, he found chaos. The people, impatient and dissatisfied with the absence of their leader, had turned to idolatry, creating a golden calf, and began worshiping it as though it were the very God who had freed them from Egypt. Moses was shocked and indignant when he saw the people's sin. He then threw the tablets to the ground, breaking them as a symbol of the broken covenant between God and the Israelites. Moses' anger was not just a personal reaction, but an expression of the gravity of the people's offense against God. The sin of idolatry at that moment was a direct violation of the covenant that had just been established. But in the midst of the anger and destruction of the tablets, Moses, in his wisdom, sought reconciliation. He climbed Mount Sinai again, interceding for his people, asking God for forgiveness and pleading for divine mercy. God, in his infinite mercy, forgave the people, but the cost of breaking the covenant was high. Moses, with new stone tablets, returned to the mountain to receive the commandments once again, renewing the pact. The delivery of the 10 Commandments at that moment of great tension was not only a law, but an invitation to faithfulness, obedience, and trust in the Lord. They now had a guide for life, but it would be a life marked by the constant need to turn to God in repentance, faith, and reverence. As Moses moved away from the camp to climb Mount Sinai again, impatience took hold of the people. They began to question the absence of their leader, who had been on the mountain for weeks. The Israelites, fearing Moses would not return, gave in to the pressure of their own insecurities. Unable to understand the need for patience and trust in God, they sought a way to feel protected and guided. And it was in this moment of weakness that an idea formed among them. Aaron, Moses' brother, was pressured by the crowd to create an idol, something tangible that would comfort and represent them. He yielded to the people's request, and with gold taken from the earrings and necklaces of the Israelites, he cast a golden calf. When the work was completed, the people rejoiced, saying, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." The worship of the calf was marked by feasting and celebrations, and the nation gave in to momentary pleasure, forgetting the God who had freed them from slavery. When Moses descended from the mountain, with the new tablets of the law in hand, the scene before him was shocking. The people were in the act of idolatry, dancing and offering sacrifices to the golden calf. Moses, filled with anger, threw the tablets on the ground, breaking them as a sign that the covenant between God and Israel was being violated. The rebellion of the people was a deep blow to the leader, who had interceded for them and sought God's mercy in earlier moments. God, outraged by the people's actions, ordered severe punishments. Moses, in his authority, had the golden calf destroyed and its ashes scattered on the waters as a demonstration of the futility of idolatry. He also called the Levites to join him, and many of the idolaters were killed as a consequence of their transgression. The idolatry of the golden calf was not just a mistake of the people, but a spiritual failure that challenged the very foundation of the relationship between Israel and God. But despite the failure, God's mercy was still present, and the covenant was renewed, with Moses once again ascending the mountain to receive new tablets of the law, reaffirming God's faithfulness to his people. With the covenant renewed between God and the people of Israel, a new phase in the spiritual journey of the Israelites began. God, desiring to dwell among his people and continue guiding them, instructed Moses to build a sanctuary, a place of worship and encounter with his divine presence. This sanctuary was to be mobile, reflecting the journey the Israelites were making through the desert, but also a sacred place where the Lord could manifest himself in a special way. The construction of the tabernacle was a major project that involved the active participation of all the Israelites. God provided precise details on what the structure should be like, the materials to be used, and even how the sacred utensils should be made. The people were instructed to bring generous offerings: gold, silver, bronze, fine fabrics, animal skins, and special wood. Upon hearing the divine instructions, the people responded with great zeal, and the most skilled artisans were chosen to carry out the work, led by Bezalel and Oholiab, who were filled with the Spirit of God to accomplish the task. As the tabernacle took shape, the people began to understand the depth of what was being created. The place was not just a center of worship. It represented the very presence of God among them. Inside the tabernacle was the holy place, where the altar of incense, the table of the showbread, and the golden lampstand were placed. But the center of the tabernacle was the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant would be placed, the symbol of God's direct presence. When the construction was completed and the tabernacle was set up, the cloud of God's glory descended upon it, confirming that he dwelt there. The people were amazed, and their worship became more intense, knowing that the Lord was in their midst, guiding them through his manifested presence and his divine laws. The long journey through the desert not only tested the patience of the Israelites, but also revealed internal tensions within the people. Korah, a prominent Levite, and his followers began to question Moses and Aaron's leadership. He argued that all the Israelites, being a chosen people of God, had the right to minister in the tabernacle, not just the priests of the tribe of Levi. Korah, along with Dathan, Abiram, and 250 leaders of Israel, directly challenged Moses and Aaron's authority, accusing them of exalting themselves and holding power unjustly. Korah's challenge was not just a power struggle, but an affront to the divine order that had been established. Moses, surprised by the boldness of the rebellion, fell to his knees in prayer before God, asking for guidance. God then told Moses to gather all of Korah's followers and the rebellious leaders and bring them to the tabernacle. There, God would give a clear sign, showing who he had truly chosen for spiritual leadership in Israel. Moses, with courage and humility, announced that if God did something extraordinary at that moment, it would confirm his authority as the chosen leader. What happened next was a terrifying event. When Korah and his followers approached, God sent immediate punishment. The earth opened beneath their feet, and the earth swallowed them alive, along with their families and all their possessions, as a clear sign of divine judgment upon the rebellion. Those who rebelled against God's authority were consumed by the earth. At the same time, a divine fire destroyed the 250 men who had offered incense, demonstrating that the priestly role was reserved exclusively for Aaron and his descendants, as God had commanded. Korah's rebellion left a hard but necessary lesson. Moses and Aaron's spiritual authority was not the result of their choice, but of God's sovereignty. Israel's life continued, But the punishment of Korah and his followers served as a reminder that challenging the divine order brings irreversible consequences. The people of Israel, though affected by what had happened, saw even more clearly the need to respect the commands and leadership that God had established to guide them on their journey. After the tumultuous events that marked the journey through the desert, God, in His mercy, prepared the people of Israel for a new chapter in their history: entry into the Promised Land. Moses, on behalf of God, commanded that 12 men, one from each tribe of Israel, be sent to Canaan to spy out the land that God had promised to their descendants. This mission, aimed at assessing the conditions of the land and the challenges the Israelites would face, seemed like an opportunity to confirm the divine promise. The spies set out and traveled through the land of Canaan for 40 days. Upon their return, they brought with them abundant fruits as proof of the land's fertility, and the enthusiasm was immediate. The land was undoubtedly rich, flowing with milk and honey, just as God had promised. However, the good news was soon overshadowed by the bad news the spies also brought. 10 of the 12 spies reported that the inhabitants of Canaan were strong and imposing, that the cities were fortified and nearly impregnable. They also spoke of giants living in the land, fearing that the Israelites had no chance of winning. Only 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, stood out. With unwavering faith, they insisted that, with God's help, the land could be conquered. They reminded the people that the Lord had already given them victories in the past, and that God's promise was greater than any obstacle. But the other spies, overwhelmed by fear, convinced the crowd that the task was impossible. Discouragement spread quickly among the people, and instead of celebrating the sight of the promised land, the people gave in to despair. Unbelief took hold of the Israelites, and in an act of rebellion against God's will, they began to murmur and question Moses' leadership. Their trust in God and His promises was destroyed by the vision of an uncertain and frightening future. In response, God became angry at their lack of faith and announced that, due to their disobedience, that generation would not enter the promised land. Only the 2 faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb, would be spared from this punishment and would see the fulfillment of the promise. The people were then condemned to wander in the desert for 40 years, until the unbelieving generation had passed away. The report of the spies became a turning point, a bitter reminder that true faith is the key to experiencing God's promises. The people of Israel, marked by unbelief after the spies' report, faced a divine punishment that would change the course of their history: a 40-year journey through the desert, away from the promised land. During this long period, the generation that doubted God's promises was destined to pass away, while the new generation, born in the desert, prepared to take possession of the land. It was both a punishment and an opportunity for renewal and learning. The journey through the desert was not easy. The scorching heat of the day and the biting cold of the night, the scarcity of food and water, the harsh terrain, and the constant internal challenges all caused the people to repeatedly murmur against Moses and God. "Why did you bring us here to die?" was a phrase that echoed on their lips at every difficulty they faced. But in His faithfulness, God continued to provide miraculously, sending manna from heaven to feed the Israelites and making water flow from rocks, showing His constant presence and faithfulness, even in the face of ingratitude. Despite God's provision, the people did not stop showing their rebellion. Many turned away from God, falling into idolatry and even raising new leaders to challenge Moses. However, every time the people questioned Moses' authority or turned away from God, a divine intervention occurred, showing them that the Lord was with Moses and that His will would be fulfilled. It was during these years that God also revealed laws and ordinances, preparing the people to live according to His holiness, so they would be ready for the great mission that awaited them. The desert, as barren and desolate as it was, became the stage for both spiritual and physical transformations. The old generation that did not believe in God's promises passed away, and the new generation, now matured and firm in their faith, prepared for the conquest of Canaan. The 40 years in the desert were not only a period of punishment, but also a purification process, where the people of Israel were shaped and prepared to fulfill their destiny. When the moment to enter Canaan finally came, the people were stronger, more united, and above all, more aware that their future victories would depend on their faithfulness to God. Moses' journey was coming to an end, and with it, one of the most painful and revealing moments of his leadership. After 40 years in the desert, God was preparing the people to finally enter the promised land, and Moses, who had been the tireless guide of this journey, found himself facing one last test of faith. However, Moses' story would not end as he had imagined. In a moment of great frustration, after another round of murmuring from the people, God instructed Moses to speak to the rock so that water would flow from it, as had happened before. But instead of obeying in a simple and direct manner, Moses, overcome by anger and exhaustion, struck the rock with his staff. The water still flowed, quenching the people's thirst, but Moses' mistake did not go unnoticed by God. Moses' disobedience reflected a lack of full trust in God's power. He, who had always trusted God to perform miracles, now acted impulsively, defying God's command. As a consequence of his sin, God announced to Moses that he would not enter the promised land. This decision was a shock to Moses, who had dedicated his entire life to guiding the Israelites to this point. He had seen the rebellious people, faced immense challenges, and fulfilled his mission with dedication and courage. However, his disobedience, though seemingly small, represented a failure to uphold the holiness and example that God required from his leadership. It was a reminder that even the greatest leaders are not above obedience to God. Though deeply saddened, Moses accepted the sentence with humility, understanding that God's sovereignty is immeasurable. Leadership would now pass to Joshua, the one chosen by God to lead the people in the conquest of Canaan. Moses, however, had the opportunity to see the promised land from a distance, from the top of Mount Nebo, before his death. Thus, Moses' journey came to an end, not with a personal victory, but with the confidence that Israel's mission would continue through another leader, Joshua. The lesson was clear. Obedience to God is fundamental, no matter how far one has come or how much has been done. Moses' death did not signify the end of the journey for the people of Israel, but the transition to a new leader. God knew that, for the conquest of the promised land to succeed, the people would need a strong, courageous, and faithful leader. This leader would be Joshua, the man chosen to carry on the mission Moses had started, but the responsibility that would fall on his shoulders would not be small. Joshua, although he had already demonstrated great faithfulness and courage as Moses' assistant, needed to be prepared to lead a nation at such a decisive moment. God then began his preparation in a clear and direct manner. In one of Moses' final speeches, he passed on to Joshua the blessings and responsibility of leading the Israelites. Moses commissioned him before the people, and everyone could see that Joshua would be the new leader, following the same divine instructions that had been given to Moses. He was instructed to be strong and courageous, reminding him that God would always be with him, just as he had been with Moses. In addition to Moses' words, Joshua also received direct instructions from God. In the moment of transition, the Lord appeared to Joshua and said, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." God's confidence and support were the foundation of Joshua's preparation. To lead a nation with so many difficulties and challenges ahead, he would need courage and an unshakable spirit, knowing he was not alone in his mission. With these words engraved in his heart, Joshua began to organize the people for crossing the Jordan River, which would be the first major obstacle to overcome in the conquest of the Promised Land. But more than that, he needed to unite the people, reinforce their faith in God, and ensure that trust in his promises was renewed. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, but with God's help, Joshua was ready to lead Israel to victory. Joshua's story would be marked by epic battles, courageous decisions, and an unshakable faith that would continue to inspire generations. Before his death, Moses knew that time was running out, and the people of Israel needed to be strengthened for what was to come. With the responsibility of leaving a lasting legacy and ensuring the covenant with God was preserved, he gathered the leaders and the Israelites for a great assembly. It was time for Moses to say goodbye, but not before delivering the most important message of his entire journey: the need for faithfulness to God. Moses began his speech by reminding the people of all they had experienced together. He recounted the long journey through the desert, the victories, and the challenges they faced, and above all, God's constant faithfulness. With a solemn tone, Moses urged the Israelites not to turn away from the commandments given by God. He knew the promised land lay before them, but also knew that Israel's prosperity and peace depended on their obedience to the Lord. "If you obey God, you will be blessed," Moses said. "But if you turn away, disaster will come upon you." His words were filled with love and concern, for he knew the future of the people was in their hands. He also spoke prophetically, warning about the dangers of idolatry and corruption. Moses knew that, once settled in the promised land, the Israelites might be tempted to follow the gods of the surrounding nations. Therefore, he emphasized the need to teach future generations about the Lord and his covenant, so that there would be no space for false beliefs. Moses' heart was focused on Israel's future, and he knew that if the people remained faithful to God, they would live a full and blessed life. "Choose today whom you will serve," he said, "but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Before concluding his speech, Moses renewed the covenant between God and the people of Israel. He reminded them of the promises made to their ancestors, especially to Abraham, and urged them to be a holy and separate nation, dedicated to worship and service to God. With words of blessing and encouragement, Moses knew his mission was complete, and the people were prepared to move forward. He trusted that, even after his death, the words he had just spoken would continue to guide Israel for generations to come. The sun was gently setting on the horizon, and Moses, now advanced in age, stood at the top of Mount Nebo, looking out over the vast scene before him. He knew the end of his journey was near, but before departing, God gave him a vision that would be both a comfort and a deep longing. From the mountaintop, Moses could see the promised land, a vast fertile region stretching to the horizon. It was the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and had long been the dream of their people. However, even though he could behold with his eyes what he had longed for, Moses knew he would never set foot in that land himself. In his infinite wisdom, God allowed Moses to see the land he had led the people of Israel toward, but the entry into that place would be the responsibility of another. Though he had led the Israelites for 40 years through the desert, facing trials and hardships, Moses would not enter the promised land. The reason for this lay in the sin he committed years before, when in a moment of frustration, he disobeyed God and struck the rock instead of speaking to it, as the Lord had commanded. This mistake, though seemingly small, was enough to prevent him from taking the final step of his mission. God spoke to Moses calmly and firmly, revealing to him that he would see the land, but would not conquer it. However, he assured him that Joshua, his successor, would lead the people into it and take possession of all the promises God had made. Moses, with a heavy heart, looked once more at the land that represented a bright future for the Israelites. He felt a mixture of satisfaction for having fulfilled his mission and sadness for not being able to share in that future with them. Moses knew his work was done, and the vision God gave him served as a reminder of God's power and faithfulness. Though he would not cross the Jordan himself, he trusted that the promise made to Israel would be fulfilled, and this brought a deep peace to his spirit. The promised land lay before his people, and he could rest knowing the journey of liberation was about to reach its final destination. The wind gently blew across the desert, carrying with it the golden sand that covered the land. Moses was about to take his final breath, aware that his time was near. At 120 years old, he had fulfilled the mission God had entrusted to him, and now it was time for him to rest. But, as with everything in his life, even his death and burial would be shrouded in mystery and divine symbolism. God, in his sovereignty, made the decision to bury Moses, but no one knew exactly where. Moses' body was taken to an unknown place, far from the eyes of men. No human witnessed the moment of his burial, and the location of his grave remained hidden forever. The Lord himself chose the place, and no man could deviate from his will. This became one of the greatest mysteries in Israel's history. Where did the great leader who led the people to freedom lie? The Bible tells us that no one knows to this day where he was buried, and this obscurity only added to the aura of reverence and respect Moses deserved. This divine choice to hide Moses' body has been interpreted in various ways throughout history. Some believe it was to prevent idolatry from arising around his tomb if people found it. Others suggest that God wanted to show that true worship should not be directed toward man, but toward the Creator himself. In any case, Moses' death and the mystery of his burial served to keep the focus on the God who had called and empowered him, not on Moses as a human figure. In the years that followed, the people of Israel continued their journey under Joshua's leadership, entering the promised land and fulfilling God's purpose for their nation. But even after his death, Moses was remembered as the great deliverer, the man who spoke with God face to face. His mysterious burial became a symbol of his obedience and humility, and his story would echo through generations as a testament to God's power and the faithfulness he demands from his people. And so, we conclude the fascinating story of Moses, a leader whose journey and legacy continue to inspire to this day. From his unlikely birth to his final hours, His life was marked by miracles, challenges, and unwavering obedience to God. Now, I want to hear from you. Which part of Moses' story impacted you the most? Leave your comment below. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you liked this video, don't forget to like and share it with your friends. Oh, and if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our amazing videos on biblical stories and much more. See you in the next video.